All right, thanks to everyone for joining. Today, we're kind of going to be talking about the pain points and the challenges of measuring success with metrics that don't always capture the customer's actual challenges or creating conflicting incentives. It can be across any department at the companies that you run into this problem. And so I've got a couple of people here that are experts in their fields, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So, Justin, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I'm Justin LaBelle. I lead a company called Edenred Benefits in the U.S., GM, SVP operations there.
Great. How about Mike?
I'm Mike Wayne. I've spent my career 20 years in fast moving consumer goods and specialty chemicals. So hopefully, I've got a bit of information useful.
Awesome. Thanks. And James?
Good morning. My name is James Baldwin. I'm the Director of Customer Experience at Rewind. We're a B2B SaaS company that helps businesses back up and recover their cloud data.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And as you can tell, we've got a pretty varied panel here today. So hopefully they'll get into some really good conversation around things like when you've got an overemphasis on NPS or CSAT without actionable insight, how you can manage and misalign between the predictive and the lagging indicators, how KPIs focus short-term wins, but then have challenges with their long-term reactives and other challenges that may exist in each of the business. So to get started, when we're really thinking about metrics that aren't capturing that successful outcome and that or they create internal conflict, what jumps into mind for everybody? For me personally, I've experienced this a number of times with professional services who, when they think about, I need to hit everything on time or on budget, and that's their North Star metric, they stop paying attention to quality. And then that ends up causing this cascading failure where support has challenges, where CSMs have challenges with renewing because the implementation was rushed. So there's many examples of this, I'm sure, across the different businesses. So why don't one of you guys jump into it and we'll kind of get a start.
Sure. I'll take a crack here, and I'll starting by broadening this here and say just generally with metrics frameworks, having any single metric is often risky. You want to have complementary or contradictory metrics just so you get a better view of it. And I'll take your NPS because that is the over the last year the most charged metric. People either love or despise it. I think it's extremely useful, but I find it more useful to bake that and CSAT and other things into a customer health score. You include things such as risk flags, usage, ACV, and you play around with the weighting on the scoring, and that gives you a much better idea to meaningful insights that can be actionable. NPS especially is, I mean, I'm very neutral on it. I like it, for instance, but it is limited and it is all too often, as I said, just used by itself, and the conversations aren't productive in my view through that lens.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can get deep into NPS. So we'll see if that comes up as a deeper topic. But Mike, James, any other thoughts on a metric that jumps into mind?
I'm lucky to be on the consumer goods side. So I get to see my days to consumer. And if I've got a product not doing well, it's going to jump out beyond 30 days before consumption. And that's my first way of knowing, hey, we might have a problem. Or conversely, if I'm seeing 10 days to consumer, oh crap, I've got to ramp up production on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting topic because the counter argument I tend to see with a lot of people talking about metrics in general is, well, we can't not measure CSAT or NPS. Like, I think there's valid reasons to measure operational metrics. In my world, like first response time tends to be a really popular metric that gets overemphasized. But the problem is if all you're doing is over-indexing on how quickly you respond to customers, but you're not resolving issues, or it's creating this cascading effect where it's deteriorating the actual customer experience, then you're kind of losing the larger focus, right? So I think we kind of need to do a mix of, look, get your operations in check and look at those operational metrics, and that's fine. but don't lose sight of the actual customer experience and the actual tie into the broader business objectives at the same time.
I love that, James. And Mike, to your comment on time to consumer, are there times where that aligns with what James is saying? Because like to his point, time to resolution or first response time, those don't always, improvements don't always improve the customer experience. So I don't know enough about the CPG world or the consumer world. So how does that work within your metric?
It's something that I've preached to every company I've started. You have to put the customer first. Any business, we're here to make money by providing something, a service or a product to the customer. And if I'm producing beer, I have to deliver that to the consumer. Beer is going to be like bread. I'm measuring my freshness. If I give you a 3-month-old loaf of bread, you're never coming to my bakery again. But if I give you 2-day-old beer, oh yeah, you're gonna buy another time, because I know that's when I can control all my internal KPIs around quality, as long as I don't have product dying out in the market.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think on the go for it.
Nope, go ahead.
All right. On the back of what kind of Mike you're saying, I mean, often with any business, you have kind of your KPIs, your core metrics, right? And those things you generally they're fairly straightforward to identify and run with, but it's on a more macro view important to always kind of reassess at a reasonable cadence what your full framework is, and just take a bigger, harder look if you're measuring the right things, back to like the complementary, contradictory, client focused metrics. And I go even further, and I wasn't going to bring this up this soon in the conversation, but what the heck, really like statistics, aside from just metrics. If you take a look at like top level business reviews, because the cadence on this and how you manage it outside of just the metrics is so important, because that's ultimately going to lead to the outcome. So having some element of statistics, trying to remove bias, really looking ultimately to outcomes. And that's even where, layering these business reviews on like you have a team, and then it rolls up to the full company, and ultimately to like profitability and revenue through the lens of the customer is the sweet spot. Tricky to get to accurately, but
Yeah, I think it's the point of the quote unquote so-called balanced scorecard, right? It's how do you think about one lever that doesn't necessarily gets offset by something else. And James, to your point on CSAT, I think there's this, in my opinion, on the CSAT side of things, it's a false metric 90% of the time, because you're actually only measuring CSAT on closed cases, on closed situations, things that are resolved. And you have this entire backlog that could be sitting there, is unresolved, and every customer is totally mad about it. But because your CSAT has been measured, you're at 98%, you look really, really good. And so I think that's one of those metrics that it's easy to hide behind and say, we've got a 98% CSAT, which is a great marketing tool, but it doesn't actually operationally drive improvement that helps your customer.
Well, absolutely. And the big challenge as well that you point out with CSAT too is, if all you're doing as a business is saying, oh, we have 95, 96% CSAT, look how awesome we are, but you're not really looking at the entirety of the customer experience, it can create a really misleading understanding of actually the experience your customers are having. The typical cliche with CSAT is that we go above and beyond. We do our best to help our customers, right? And if you think about, a hypothetical example, if you're working at a call center and you get a call from a customer and you say, oh, I had a question about my bill, and you say, oh, here's 3 months free. And, the customer's, oh, I'm so super happy. But then you actually look at the customer's experience and, well, what if they had to call in, they had to spend 2 hours on hold to get through to somebody, the person they got through to hung up on them, they had to start again, then they get transferred, they had to go through like this huge thing, and it took them half a day to get their issue resolved. Did you actually create a good customer experience, right? Does your 96% CSAT actually represent the value and the happiness that your customer actually has with your company, right? So CSAT's a good metric to measure in a narrow vacuum, right? Did your support team properly do the things that they should be doing to resolve issues the way that you want them to do it? But it should not be the leading kind of KPI that you should be looking at to understand how effective your support team is on the business.
James, you call it a good kind of adjacent component there, which is in your example, you also just ruined your margin by ultimately giving away a bunch of stuff for free. So you're paying for CSAT essentially. So that's the trickier thing about the whole framework that it's I don't want to make it, I'm sure none of us want to make this sound difficult. It's functionally not. You just have to have the right mindset and culture organizationally to align around this and have real conversations. And it's really more about a culture of collaboration and not a punitive one where leaders are, ultimately trying to hide behind these, I hate the term vanity metrics, but I'll use it, right? Um, and I mean, another one back to your core question here, Philippe, is marketing leads, right? Like everybody loves that one. It's just you generate a lot of leads, and then ultimately, what does that do for revenue though? If the um, just the kind of going through the filters and the stages there, it doesn't really result in what you're looking for. It's difficult to consider that a high value one in a vacuum.
I would agree. Recently I was leading a team, and the marketing team was touting 110, 120% lead generation off their target. And we were hitting 50% on the sales targets. And I'm like, there's a disconnect immediately at that point. And I think that is applicable to so many different metrics. It's easy to make a specific, it's just like any other data set. You can spin the data to look whatever way you want. And so whether it's beer in Mike's case, where it's like, hey, how many beer bottles are people drinking? It's like, is that a good thing, or are they just getting drunk and they're not enjoying the beer, and therefore they might as well go to the lowest cost provider instead of a high quality provider? Like, there's lots of these metrics out there. And I don't think it matters what business you're in. I think it matters how do you think about that customer experience and your drive to deliver the overall value for your company and your shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about areas that we believe that they're conflicting measurements, and like you've mentioned one, Justin, as an example between marketing and sales and leads and actual closes, what other metrics, Mike or James, do you think of in your businesses that are conflicting in nature, that are driving the wrong behavior at the company, that should be thought about differently?
I'll just take the first stab there, Mike.
Yeah, all right. I'm coming up with an example, and one of the measurements that I love watching is my cost of goods. And it's really easy for anybody, if you're coming from the accounting department saying, hey, why are we spending $2 a bottle on raw materials and we're only getting $5? So 40% cost of goods is pretty insanely high. And that's something where if I were to allow the accountants to have an uninformed opinion, that would create an issue if they were to tell me to cut costs. Now, all of a sudden, if I start putting $1 in each bottle, consumers have a negative experience, and that harms brand reputation. So I can have anywhere between $2 and $3 in a bottle, depending on a style of beer. And my margins are going to be lower on some. Those are my loss leaders. That gets people in. When they perceive value, they'll try others. And that's where having a diversified portfolio of products helps. So that, yeah, I can lose margin on the higher ABV beers. I can lose a little margin because you're not crushing a 24 pack of 8% beer. You're going to go for one, maybe two, and then you're going to stick to the 5%. And I'm going to get that tertiary or quaternary sale.
I love that example. And I think product distribution is so critical. And I think it's one thing if you're a single product company, obviously, then it doesn't matter as much. But anytime you got multi-products, there's going to be ones that have a higher margin and a lower margin. So you have to think about it, whether it's physical goods, whether it's SaaS, whether it's whatever that looks like, services. Each of those has a critical component to your long-term success. And you just have to think about, okay, is the margin too low for me to sustain this business? There's loss leaders that truly will put your company out of business. And then there's loss leaders that are valuable to you as a business. I mean, it's how supermarkets run a lot of their end caps. It's like, hey, come in, buy this $1 bucket of Oreos. And you're like, they're not making money off that, but you're in the store and you're buying $100 worth of goods.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? And when I think about kind of conflicting metrics, I actually think more broadly around kind of conflicting priorities within departments. So in SaaS, right, we have product teams that are constantly iterating. And, one of the main things that product teams try to do is focus on feature adoption and engagement, right? How much can we get our customers to actually do the thing we want them to do on our website or buy this thing or whatever else? And so product tends to be really focused on trying to ship new things as frequently as they possibly can, but they aren't always necessarily focused on the support impacts as a result of that. And so support, obviously, at the same time, is trying to look at things like ticket deflection, time for resolutions, things along those lines. And so oftentimes I've seen situations where there's direct conflicts with those two things where product's like, yeah, look at all this cool stuff we're shipping. And support goes, what is this thing? I have no idea. I've never heard of this before. We have to figure all this out. And it creates this really terrible experience where the two teams don't actually work in unison. But ultimately, we're still all together trying to achieve the same sort of common goal at the company level. So when I think about conflict, that's like one of the first things that kind of comes to mind is like, how can we improve the relationship and get more narrowly focused on working together to achieve kind of goals in unison?
I think that point on goals in unison is excellent, and that's tricky. And I don't know, I've been experimenting with stuff for a lot of years, and certainly don't have all the answers on it. But speaking in terms of structurally, like if you look at functions, and if we take your example, James, like product and support, I mean, look at every single function, like a SaaS company, for example. They have their metrics, and I would say with confidence, you want metrics on timing, quality, productivity, because that's. And then I also like to have, in many cases, metrics on cost, which is related to productivity, but that there's an overarching element that can, back to the COGS example from Mike, if you're kind of rolling it up, it normalizes this stuff. The tricky thing, though, is, how do we get, like, is there some creative metric out there between product and support that is like yet to be devised that could be like the silver bullet, so to speak, that gets through, kind of carves through these natural conflicts, or like the sales and marketing? And I mean, my answer to that so far is you just keep rolling it up, and ultimately it just comes down to like the revenue or the profitability number driven by client experience. But I'm always thinking, is there something I'm missing here? How could we solve this differently?
There was a silver bullet, I think everybody would be like, that's the
Yeah.
thing. I'm the millionaire that's built it,
Yeah.
trademarked it. But it's always an interesting conversation. Sorry, James.
No. I mean, that's exactly the point. What I found is, you still have this cliche, you need to roll everyone up to kind of corporate metrics and make sure they're all kind of working towards. And the closest thing I found to that silver bullet is LTV, right? Ultimately, LTV, for those unfamiliar, customer lifetime value, support directly impacts that, product directly impacts that, your dev and engineering teams directly impact that, right? So that's one of the metrics that I've been trying to look at, understanding like what are all the various levers that can contribute towards LTV, and then how can we work in this particular example with product to say, okay, well, this feature is going to increase LTV. How do we support product? How can we use like voice of customer insights or whatever it may be to continue to try to help kind of grow that metric? Or if you're in a financially difficult situation, not have it continue to go down in some cases.
It seems to me, and when we think about that kind of silver bullet, there's this metric when you think about it, it's the kind of, if you think about an adoption LTV mix, because people don't adopt if there's a problem, right? And that's whether you're talking software or you're talking beer that has some floating thing in it, or whatever that might be. Like, people will not continue to buy and use your product if there's a bug. And I can use the word bug in a very generic way here. But if there's a bug in the system, then people are not going to continue to use it. And so that's product metric, that's a support metrics, that's an impact to renewal rates, to rebuy rates, to ongoing rates. So there is this interesting perspective that I've seen out there around adoption being a very strong metric. And that is, and I guess in the consumer physical goods space is probably like shelf, percentage of shelf or something along those lines, where depending on how much of a shelf you own, you have more people buying it. And so there's probably some similar metric, but it is, how do you think about that holistic customer in the long run? And I don't know that there's a perfect solution. NPS definitely isn't it. Justin, you mentioned at the beginning, I think NPS is an interesting metric. I'm agreed with you. I'm neutral. I like it, but at the same time, it is not the silver bullet that people talked about years and years ago. They're like, oh, that's going to tell the whole story. So I think that there's another metric around there.
I like both your point and James' point on the LTV, although you got to be everybody has to be aligned to how that's calculated ultimately with finance owning and your user. And I mean, often what I've found is just when you roll it up, there is some element of a major KPI, such as a usage or adoption with a cost denominator of some sort. And that's, aside from a kind of a replacement for just EBITDA or gross margin or whatever, I think it can be very, very useful. And if you can define a few of those rolling into EBITDA or whatever your main financial profitability metric is, that can tell a good story. And I think that the thing, not to just contradict the entire purpose of this entire session on metrics, is the leadership of this and the cadence and the conversations you have, kind of the culture within your organization is just so important, because you'll see so many organizations that maybe even have the right metrics, KPIs, and then it's just not actionable. So I think that is just a vital part of the conversation to get results.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I read an article or saw a video recently, I can't remember which, about the whole growth at all costs that existed in the software world for the last, 15 years. And now it's more of responsible growth. And it's also the challenge with growth at all costs is at all cost. And so humans scale at a linear speed. No matter what you do, humans are linear. 4 humans do about 4 times as much work as 1 human on average, right? And yes, there's like water cooler chat and 4 people start to talk more. So it actually is a little bit less than that. And I think in the new world for software, and I don't know, Mike, I'm curious if AI is going to, how AI will impact beer actually in your world. But in the software world, AI will help us scale 4 humans to be 8 humans, to be 10 humans, to be much faster and better and more accurate. So the metrics will have to change accordingly. And I think that's going to be an interesting path. And it is actually one of the questions that I've got for this panel to talk about. So, but Mike, I'm really curious, how is AI going to impact the beer world? Just out of curiosity.
I'm lucky to be in the chemistry side, so AI isn't going to do much at my level. When I say we, I'm talking other scientists. We're most excited about AI's contribution, especially around protein folding. When we start to develop these models that can predict protein folding, you're going to see a revolution in human evolution. because we're going to be able to treat more diseases. We're going to be able to cure more diseases. Brewing is a 15,000-year-old science, and the most recent breakthrough was Louis Pasteur. I don't have much hope on what's coming with AI. You still have to make the physical product. Is a large language model going to help us with that? It can help me on the business side if I find that I use ChatGPT more than Google now. So there's one of my shifts because I hated sorting through ads. And right now, one of these apps can just give me fast, clean information, which is what I want. That does help me make faster, better decisions around a company. But are they going to do the brewing? No, yeast is the employee of the month for the last 15,000 years.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's interesting. So when we think about kind of how metrics are going to change across whatever industry, do we feel that AI is going to change the primary metrics that we should be thinking about? So is lifetime value and recurring revenue or recurring customers still the North Star metric in the AI world, or does that change?
I think go for it.
I'm going to go with Warren Buffett on that you still care about profit. EBITDA is a derivative that can make it up, which if I'm selling my business, I'm going to focus on EBITDA. If I'm buying a business, I'm going to focus on profits. And well, we are currently witnessing a car company that has an ungodly amount of cars visible from space and a customer base that is rejecting them. So is there any special insights that they're using? No, you got to look at overall sales. And if sales plummet, crap, you're in trouble.
I like that, Mike, and I'll build off that and say I don't think your major metrics are going to change. Even if we zoom in from the highest level, profitability, EBITDA, whatever that is. If we go back to, quality, productivity, timing, I think what will happen and what I've been thinking about and starting to employ in capacities as it comes up is you should have a carve out specific to the AI to identify how effective the AI is within the quality, timing, and productivity. Because you want to isolate, and I'm not saying I don't believe AI is going to help, but it is important for you to be able to isolate and quantify the impact, because then you can just make better business decisions.
Yeah, that's a big part of what I was going to say as well, Justin. It's just like, I think with the evolution of AI, and I mean, we use AI, I think a lot of times in like a generative sense, but AI has like been part of what we've been doing for over a decade, right, at this point. But I think that you're going to need a set of metrics specifically for AI, because AI is going to be able to take off the low-hanging fruit from CS and CX teams, right? And I think what that's actually going to do is it's going to invent different KPIs for human-based interactions that can be maybe more focused on like customer friction, or again, more on the experience side than rather, oh, I helped somebody update their credit card number or something generic like that, right? So I don't necessarily think those top line KPIs are going to shift or change fundamentally, but I think those are going to be more owned, or at least some of those are going to be more owned from the AI side, and then the human side will actually have kind of complementary but different metrics at the same time.
I think it'll be, go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say that we're all in trouble if AI becomes self-aware.
Yeah, it's funny. So there's actually a couple of people that one says it's 2028 and the other says it's 2038 or beyond. And so I'm like, you're both leading scientists in the AI space.
Yeah.
Those are very big differences in timeframes. So I've got a little bit of a contrary opinion on the way that I think AI will impact. I don't think it changes the metric itself. I think what it does is it changes our ability to forecast and identify the metric in a much better, stronger way. And so for lifetime value, for example, I think what it does is allows us to, in real time, identify exactly what and why customers are leaving before they even think about leaving. I think it will become a much more early predictor so that companies can get in front of things significantly faster so that they don't even risk the renewal by then improving that customer experience, because they have the ability, especially in the SaaS world, to look at the telemetry of every single piece that's happening. And AI will quickly be able to say, oh, well, the usages have declined by 0.3%, which has this impact. And a human would never be able to identify that. And so I think that that's going to be the way that AI changes the metric space. And I think that's really where it works on the tech space. It works on a consumer space. At a macro level, you start to think about number of bottles across the world that are sold by that, and being able to see in this country or this region, this particular bottle has reduced its sales by the smallest microcosm, and there are these influencing factors that exist in that region, therefore there's risk, or therefore there's no risk. And so I think that's going to be the area that AI really changes the metric space and how and why we measure things to get to that telemetry.
That's a good point because I mean, really to broaden this AI metrics, I mean, my example was probably mostly around like support services, but every single metric we have, we could take a hard look at AI influence on that. And to your point, like churn, a great example. And I like that because it's a variety of elements where, I mean, we could theoretically do what you're referring to. You would need probably like a full-time analyst with good statistics background, but that comes down to the cost then and the speed and et cetera. So thanks for sharing that one.
Yeah, and I mean, I was working for a company who we had a chief data scientist and an ops team and everything else, and this was years ago, but they could only, and this was at a $25 billion company, right? And so they only had the ability to look at slices at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that changes. It makes that one data scientist
scale
100 times more effective, because they can help model. And now that becomes their role, is helping the models be more effective to help all of 25 billion instead of maybe $1 billion that they can focus on. And I think that's going to be the critical component on how organizations need to start thinking about AI in terms of metrics, is the global nature, the complexities, the multi-product, the hundreds of pieces of telemetry. And I can't remember, someone mentioned health scores earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Health scores today, you can really only put in a handful of metrics to create a good health score, because you don't know what those levers are, and the movements are so minute. AI can put in 100 metrics and be like, the movements are small enough, but I don't care, because the technology behind it will be able to figure it out.
The consumer goods example actually reminded me of I think a really good analogy for this is there's a very, very popular burger chain that operates globally. And one of the things that's always impressed me about this particular chain is their ability to adapt to the various market conditions in each kind of area of the world, right? And I can only imagine the size of the manpower that's been required historically to understand what those kind of geographical trends are in those regional markets. And I really think AI can actually really take a big influence in that particular segment to understand much more quickly than humans could ever do, and understand, say, hey, like we're seeing a shift in consumer buying habits in these particular regions, or preferences are changing from X, Y to Z, or whatever it may be, and allow the company to evaluate options to optimize their profits or their sales more quickly than ever before. And when you look at it from more of a sales capacity side of things, again, allows your team to more proactively shift and saying, okay, let's help work with our partners in these particular areas. How can we kind of work in a way that says, hey, here's some more insights for you, here's some more data, here's whatever it may be, and work in a much more close partnership than may have already existed in the past.
I'm talking to a QSR advisory company that's doing QSR, which is quick service restaurant, and they do exactly that. They're looking at all the way from store level changes in the drive-through and the speed to order and the order management, all the way up to regions, and then states, and then national. And they're working with a number of these larger chains to do this analysis. And it's really interesting to see how in depth they can get with, oh, your drive-through has changed by 0.1 seconds. And now I can predict that your sales over the next 3 weeks or 3 hours are going to reduce because your drive-through is slowed down, or whatever that might look like. And I think that's that interesting trick, that it's figuring out the right things that measure and how those impact. It's no different realistically than what we've done for years and years with a human. Now it just goes a lot faster.
I think a lot of that just operationally is about, identifying the constraints in the system, and that's where it'll have the level of sensitivity, to your point, speed and effectiveness. But I mean, even at times, it's difficult for humans to identify the correct constraint in the system, and they might say, "Oh, I think this is the problem," and then they inadvertently hurt the business.
Right? Yeah, pull the wrong lever and you go the wrong
Yep.
direction. So we have a few minutes left. A question that I wanted to ask everybody is there a framework, a best practice that you look at on how to align your outcomes with the company goals? Like when you go into a new organization or into a particular problem, how do you know and how do you think about making sure that your customer outcomes and your company goals are aligned? And what kind of framework, whether it's a formal one or one like I do this, that people could maybe learn from?
One of the things that I've done at every company, because I'm in such a competitive industry, I coach the teams to take care of the customer at all costs. If you walk into one of my establishments, you're going to be taken care of. And even if I lose money on our interaction, if you have a bad meal and I have to eat the food cost for a group of 10, it's taking care of the customer at all costs, because I know that's 10 people that are going to walk away and give a good review despite a negative experience. So I'm going to get their friends and the friends of friends as customers, and I'm going to get a chance to grow my brand despite a loss.
I love that.
Yeah, I think for me, because certainly Mike, I agree with that, and it wants to be customer or user focused in any way. Ultimately, it really comes down to the systems I put in place. So we'll have like metrics portfolios, initiatives portfolios that not only take a look at, okay, the metrics are managing our business as usual, our core, and then the initiatives are transformational. How are we going to outpace the speed of change? And I know it's a metrics conversation, but there's a big relationship around looking to the future, how you need to evolve, identifying potentially new metrics, new goals, new areas of sensitivity. And then ultimately, the biggest thing, back to my point on the leadership and management, is you get a very good cadence with good data, things like run rate and some statistical basics where you can separate signal and noise. And that is just ingrained in the culture.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
I've tried to take a framework-based approach in the past, but what I found, again, especially in SaaS, is that businesses change so frequently that one framework generally won't continue to work either at the same company or at other companies. I've worked within product, and what I found within product was, again, something like a voice of the customer program, what directly took a look at like how do we influence and help product make better decisions, help them get better data to continue to deliver and create products that optimize for the customer, was ultimately the best framework to work, because that directly rolled up to business objectives and really helped to make sure that our team was optimizing our value. However, I've worked in other teams where we work within revenue, right? And VOC isn't as valuable in that particular situation. And so we're more focused on, say, like LTV and how do we actually influence and impact LTV and look through those metrics that way, right? So it's really understanding like what is the business priorities at any given time, and how can you work within those business priorities and translate that into ways that your team is best positioned to help influence. And it really depends, again, on your business, the growth stage you're in, the market you're in, all that sort of stuff.
I would agree. I think for me, I don't know that there's a framework either. It's evaluating what metrics are currently in play. And do I agree with them? Do I throw them out? Do I add? And making sure that you don't have 100 metrics that you're looking at least not on a dashboard overall level. I think that it depends on where you stand in your hierarchy, as it were, on what metrics matter the most. But it is that roll up metric and figuring out how do you drive kind of that net retention and really growing your customer base and making sure that they keep coming back, that they keep growing with you, that more customers keep adding. I think a lot of companies forget to measure. They measure NRR or net retention percentages, but they forget to measure their number of logos. And so they look at their net retention, and you've got companies that are growing at 110, 120% year over year, but their logos are actually shrinking. And in the long run, that's a risk to the business because you've got your existing customers that keep growing with you, and you're not gaining enough new customers to offset. And so at some point, your existing customers will stop buying quite as much from you. It's just kind of at some point you get too expensive, right? So you have to be cautious with that. And so I think that's for me, figuring out what the right levers are and making sure that you're looking at all of that space to get there. One last question for you. Oh, go ahead.
On that just a little bit there, because you touched on one particular thing that I think is a trap for a lot of people in support teams and businesses in general, and that's saying, okay, well, we have these sets of KPIs, let's just keep measuring these sets of KPIs, and being too afraid to either invent new KPIs based off of what your business is trying to achieve, or just entirely saying, I don't think these are the right things that we should be measuring, right? Like if you're a company that has an active onboarding cycle, sometimes you might see companies saying, oh, like how quickly can we get customers to the end of an onboarding cycle, but forgetting why the customer purchased your product to begin with, and just trying to say like maybe it's a metrics and saying what percentage of time are customers able to realize the value of why they purchased this to begin with, right? Or, I was looking at research the other day around customer effort score. I'm a big proponent of customer effort, but one of the twists on this that I'm actually looking at right now is a value effort score. How fast and how easily can customers get to a point where they perceive that they're receiving the value that they expected from your product or service? Right. So that would be the one big thing I would also just kind of add on to your point there is like, don't be afraid to experiment with different KPIs and metrics that really optimize for what your business or what your team can actually be measuring and influencing.
I'd also add, James, that and kind of to your earlier point too, Philippe, that I am okay with a lot of metrics because it actually drives what James is getting. I mean, you need to be reasonable about this. And kind of drive innovation while actually managing the outcomes. But finding that balance, as you get more comfortable with this, and there's more exposure with KPIs, your whole team will get this level of sensitivity where they kind of know, like this one isn't hitting the mark. We got to modify it. That's where you can get creative and good things happen from there.
Nope, I think so too. We're almost out of time. So last question. If there was one metric that you either use or have used a lot, your current company uses, that you see people talking about all the time, that you go, I wish that metric would just die, or I just want to get rid of that metric because it doesn't drive the value, and here's why, what would that be? And I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think, because I know that was a question I sprung on you. And so for me, James, you kind of mentioned it. It's actually time to onboard. I don't like time to onboard because the onboarding can be anything. It's not a valuable from a customer's lens. And I think that's how we have to look at all these metrics that are driving our behavior, that it's what is the customer getting out of this? So it's not time to onboard, it's time to value. It's when does that customer gain the value from your product? And it might be 3 months after they're onboarded. It might be 3 weeks before they're onboarded. So it changes the metrics significantly. So I personally don't like time to onboard or time to launch or whatever that metric might be at your particular business.
The metric I would get rid of is EBITDA. It's earnings before, and in business, all we care about is earnings after. there are benefits. I liked, because I've been able to go through multiple countries. I had products that were losing money in Canada, and I was frustrated. If I'm selling a can of beer and taking a loss, how in the hell are we still functioning as a company? And I found out it was because my controller, she was absolutely brilliant. In Canada, the CRA allows you to choose your own depreciation. So in the States, you got 10 years to depreciate CapEx. Well, she chose to depreciate over 3 years. And I'm thinking, I had to take 3 times the hit on my debt service. And I'm wondering, what is the sense in that? And I loved her answer. In 3 years, we might need to expand. And when we go to a bank completely debt free, they're going to run to give us money. I thought that was brilliant. So I couldn't use EBITDA because the team was at a larger viewpoint, and all we cared about was profits.
That makes sense.
I'm going to go with a probably pretty controversial metric here, especially in my space. And that's FCR, first contact resolution. I think there's a tremendous value on making sure that when a customer contacts your team, that you're able to resolve things in the first interaction. Don't get me wrong. But the reason why I'm going to speak about this particular metric is I think it's measured inconsistently across companies, right? Some people measure it as, oh, did a ticket reopen in a certain period of time? Or, others track it differently. Like I've seen so many different measures of this, but ultimately, I think it also devalues the benefit that multi-interaction conversations can have, right? Sometimes you need and want your team to proactively say, hey, we need to do a back and forth. We need to bring in account management. We need to bring in other resources to make sure that this root cause issue is actually resolved and that you're not going to contact us again next week or next month about this particular issue, right? And so again, it's more optimizing on reducing effort for customers to get issues resolved or questions answered, and ultimately, again, improving customer experience at the same time. So it's not necessarily saying kill FCR, but think about it a little bit differently, maybe more like the effort reduction side of the spectrum.
I'll go with the whole category, because I think what James kind of categorically is saying is this like nebulous bit that ultimately isn't like what is it driving, and if it's nebulous, then it's questionable. So the whole category I'm going to go with, and I'll give some examples here, is just any metric that isn't anchored in like a reasonable denominator. So like lead generation, or number of X produced, or because then you can just game it where this absolute number is increasing and that is good. But of course it's not, because is it anchored in number of people or total cost or some sort of client experience denominator? So anytime, I mean, and that's my point. Like those can be good metrics, just pure numbers, but you have to have a broader population of metrics to get good visibility, so that those aren't harmful and over-index you.
No, I think that's great. I think FCR is a funny one because I had someone recently tell me it's open within 24 hours, and my old call center or my old group, it was open within the next month. And I'm like, that's a pretty big variance on FCR.
Yeah.
So no, but I really appreciate the conversation, y'all. I think it's been really interesting, and I think people who are looking for some advice and thoughts on metrics will get a lot of value. So I wanted to say thank you all for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Cheers.